organizing, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm so excited to have Mike Grady back. I have given the introduction to his first lecture last quarter, but for those of you who were not here, Mike Grady is a very good friend, and also he was an advisor to the foundation many years ago. We worked together at the Department of Arts and Consciousness at John F. Kennedy. He has an MFA, and he's a painter, writer, and educator. He has taught art at the college level for over 40 years and has a special interest in Asian art, philosophy, and spirituality. He was the dean of the students at the San Francisco Art Institute before he became the chair of the Department of Arts and Consciousness. Actually, when he came to the department, he was the one who started the MFA program there, and that was really incredible to watch him create this program. It was a fantastic program. He was one of the developers of the international MFA program at the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou in China. Mike is currently a professor of the studio art at Appalachian State University. The topic he will be addressing today is very close to the heart of the co-founders of this foundation. Gordon Onslow Ford, his formal training in art was in Chinese calligraphy for 5 years, and learning about Asian aesthetics and philosophy. And in fact, his first book, Painting in an Instant, was a la Zen. My master's degree, the concentration was in Asian philosophy and practice of Qi. So much of my dialogue with Onslow Ford often was around the Asian philosophy, how that connects with art, how we bring the notion of energy or Qi or the philosophical part of it into art practice. So I'm really excited to have Mike, who is an expert in this, to give us his view of this topic. So thank you so much, Mike, for coming back, and really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Great. Hi, everybody. Great to see so many familiar faces, good friends. We were just sort of reshuffling the deck. So I've become a little bit, the blur between this lecture and the lecture that I'm about to do in May got to be a little problematic. So I'm going to really talk about Guanxi, that word that is so hard to pronounce. It means relationship, but let me share a screen and I'll explain a little bit more about it. Yeah. There we go. Okay, can everybody see Guanxi? Yep, great. Okay, so Guanxi was explained to me when I first started going to China in 1991, when I was still at San Francisco Art Institute. We developed an exchange program with the China Academy of Art. And as I was trying to learn about Chinese language and Chinese culture, everyone explained to me that this word, Guanxi, which literally means, it's translated most often as meaning relationship, was the most important word in Chinese culture, because everything in China is about its relationship to everything else. Even the language reflects it. If you have the word for an empty glass, you don't call it a glass, you call it a glass thing, like a beizi. You have to refer to a thing as its name only if it's doing its job, if it has a relationship. The Chinese term for something that doesn't matter is something that has no guanxi, meo guanxi. So you can basically ignore anything in the world that doesn't pertain to you. It's the way it was explained to me that 1 billion people live in harmony with each other. If there's something that doesn't concern you, you don't bother with it. There are too many people to get involved with. If you get involved with everyone, then you'll be chasing yourself around in a circle. So Guanxi is not only about relationship, it's about the specialness of having a relationship, not just with other people, but with everything. And it's that larger definition of Guanxi that I'm most interested in as an artist. So When I first started going to China, Guanxi was a word that everybody used to describe all kinds of things. About 5 or 6 years ago, it fell into disfavor. The word Guanxi, like many other old terms, has been kind of outlawed, not outlawed officially, but the Xi Jinping regime has basically equated the word Guanxi with corruption. It's the good old boy network. It's the idea that I'm trying to work my controls here. It's the idea that you scratch my back, I scratch yours. That's Guanxi. If you want to get something done in China, you have to have Guanxi. You have to have a relationship with someone. If you have no relationship with anyone, you can't do anything. People in business stress that in order to do business in China, you first have to establish Guanxi, a relationship with the people you're doing business with. So it's all about interconnection. The handshake, the network, all of those things have become synonymous in the minds of most contemporary Chinese with Chinese culture itself. The implications of Guanxi in art are probably most exemplified by this early 1994 piece by the conceptual artist Zhang Huan. And this basically, a photograph is entitled "How to Add 1 Meter to an Anonymous Chinese Mountain." And he just took a bunch of people, got them to take their clothes off and lay on top of each other and measured 1 meter of human flesh to make this mountain an anonymous Chinese mountain 1 meter taller. It has to do with the idea that instead of art being about me telling you something, it's about us. It's a collective, it's a unified vision. And I'll talk about the history of how we got to this state where Guanxi, I think, becomes the defining principle of art in the 21st century. So we start by picturing enlightenment. We make images of enlightenment. We talk about spiritual art. Well, what does spiritual have anything to do with? Guanxi is not a spiritual term. In fact, the word spiritual in Chinese, Shen, is really reserved for sort of superstitious practices. They don't think that Qi, the human animating force, or Guanxi has anything to do with spirituality at all. It's part of the culture. It's built in. For the Westerners, we have to envision connection as enlightenment. So how do we do that? We talk about being on a spiritual path. Well, the spiritual path is something that we take for granted these days, but it's a fairly recent thing. The only genuine spiritual path separate from religious practice is yoga. And yoga, we know, goes back, we believe, to the Indus Valley civilization prior to 1800 BC. There was a culture that we don't know anything about that had very advanced cities, had very advanced written language system, and mysteriously they have all of these tiny little seals with this mysterious creature doing the lotus position. It looks like he's doing yoga. The beginnings of yoga in Veda and Vedanta really stem from this early progenitor culture of India that we know nothing about. But the idea of doing yoga is separate from believing in Krishna or believing in Vishnu or practicing the religion as it's taught, but instead having to do with an individual spiritual quest. We follow the Buddha, but we do it by actually thinking for ourselves and finding, and this is the important link, we find connection. When we do a spiritual practice, ultimately, it's not about us, it's about dissolving ourselves into a larger self. So my definition of spirituality, which is only operant in terms of what I'm going to talk about, precludes spiritual practice, precludes many things that are associated with being a spiritual person. I've been told recently that I'm not a particularly spiritual person. And depending on your perspective, I may not be. I'm not very religious. I don't believe in a personal God, but spirituality has to do more with that word Guanxi. It has to do more with that ability to reach out and connect with the rest of the universe. It's the essence of Buddhism. It's the essence of the effect of spiritual transformation. This is a 9th century Indian terracotta sculpture of somebody in moksha, in release, the moment of spiritual bliss that comes from the recognition that you don't even exist. Everything is about relationship. Everything is about dissolving the boundaries of our own existence into a larger self. It can be called Buddha, it can be called God, it can be called the universe, it can be called the New York Yankees if you're a really avid sports fan. You dissolve yourself into something else that's bigger than you are, and at that moment of release, you feel bliss. The European tradition of spirituality is quite different from that. It's not about dissolving yourself into the universe, it's about fitting yourself into a structure. The Vitruvian Man of Leonardo da Vinci is really the European idea of order and rationality and reason. European spirituality is built on the use of signs and symbols. We put ourselves literally into an architectural structure, in this case, a 9th century Christian icon of Jesus. But what signifies the divinity of this image isn't the spiritual quest that the artist was on. It's a series of formulas. The cross that centers right in the middle of his forehead is on the book that he's holding. This is not Christ on a cross. This is Christ as a rabbi. This is the idea that teaches us that if we believe in Jesus and we read the Bible, that we will achieve salvation. It's a very, very potent spiritual path. The mystics associated with that, the mysticism associated with that, really becomes evident in sacred spaces in Christianity. We look up into the apse and we see this odd sort of eyeball-shaped thing above us, and we realize that it's really the mandorla. It's the two circles intersecting each other. Where the circles intersect, we call it sometimes a Venn diagram. But for the early Christians, it was a way of bringing that spiritual experience, that symbol of connection to Jesus Christ that has spiritual power. But again, we become the observer of spirituality. Rather than becoming connected, we simply observe connection. In the great traditions of European art, that moment of moksha, that moment of spiritual release, really takes place in rapture. This is Francisco Zurbarán's painting of Saint Francis in religious ecstasy. He's holding a skull, signifying his ability to transcend life and death, but he's absolutely in a state of bliss, depicted through a really limited palette and really dramatic lighting. Lighting becomes the metaphor. His moment of connection is the discovery, literally, of the light. This image of the crucifixion, the Isenheim altarpiece of Matthias Grunewald, basically depicts the Christian view of spirituality. And again, we become passive viewers observing these beautiful images that illustrate the concept of spirituality. We start with the Annunciation on the left, move through the Bible stories. Christ is being entombed at the base of this sculpture, or excuse me, this altarpiece that opens up and becomes its own sacred space, culminating in the image of Jesus rising to heaven and literally turning into a ball of light. The dissolution of form into light becomes a really, really crucial part of contemporary spiritual practice. In Asia, the idea of spiritual practice had to do with eliminating the importance of the individual and instead acknowledging the fact that we are simply part of the flow of everything and a not particularly important part of things. So where European culture is anthropocentric. East Asian culture is nature-centered. So here are the little carbuncles on the face of nature. And here is a wonderful balance between nothing and something. Literally, the relationship, the Guanxi, between nothing and something is the foundation, not just for this painting, but for East Asian culture in general. The Nine Dragon Scroll by Chen Rong is the East Asian equivalent of the Vitruvian Man, where the Europeans follow a very ordered and architectural vision of the universe. The East Asian view is quite the opposite, a counterpoint based on infinite variability, flow, and relationship. Here, an early image, and I think the idea of spiritual practice really emanates from Zen Buddhism. This is the one-stroke Bodhidharma, which has a colophon attached to it, which metaphorically says basically to become the Buddha, point directly to the human heart and achieve enlightenment. So whether it's a one-stroke vision of the Buddha or this caricature image, which is used throughout Zen Buddhism of Bodhidharma, the founder of Zen Buddhism, the idea is the same, that we find a moment, not a picture. This picture is not enlightenment. It's the act of making the picture that is. So the idea of the Wenren, the literati painter, the scholar artist, is at the foundation of the Chinese fascination with Guanxi, but it's also about having a vision for what artists do in the world that isn't about making sacred objects that sell at auction for millions of dollars. It's about being part of the flow oneself. The use of Tai Chi Chuan here demonstrates that even this practice that millions of Chinese do every morning is really not about health. It's not about exercise. It's about remembering that you're part of the flow. This painting by Shitao really shows the sage, the ideal of the scholar painter, the literatus, floating through space as a way of exemplifying the connection to nature. The Wenren, the scholar painters, lived in little huts in the middle of the wilderness and contemplated the flow of the universe. This is Shitao in his little mountain retreat, painting in a style that's very contemporary. Here, Shitao, Shenzhou, the Ming Dynasty, generally acknowledged as the leading artist of the Ming Dynasty, shows himself on a mountaintop. I think I talked about this last time, but the idea is that the artist stands apart from nature, does not practice Guanxi, but instead stands simultaneously as part of everything and isolated from everything. Caspar David Friedrich had the same idea when he did The Wanderer. Jacob van Ruysdael was trying to make the idea of Guanxi manifest in the landscape. Instead of making images of God, he made images of nature. His idea of nature was the sky. The steeple in the cathedral in Haarlem, which is actually depicted about 10 times larger than the actual one, is meant to point the way to spiritual connection. The church just gives us the pointing in the right direction. The golden field in the middle ground is a sign of divine benevolence. But the idea of this, which was consistent with the Protestant perspective of spirituality, was that in order to really find God, you don't do it through the church, you do it through direct experience. So that idea of Guanxi really has to do with the idea of experiencing nature firsthand, not mediated by texts or following the rules, but instead going out and having the experience. Here, Joseph Turner or William Turner dissolving himself into nature as he views Venice circa 1837. He made many paintings of Venice, but as he grew older and more aware, he understood the relationship between himself and nature was light. It came to a head for him when he tied himself to the mast of the steamship when he was crossing the English Channel and had a physical, a visceral experience of the forces of nature. He died about 6 years later of complications from the pneumonia he received as a consequence of this stunt. And his last words, according to biographers, were that the sun is God. Oh yes, the sun is God. Light is what connects us all. Light is Guanxi. Van Gogh realized the same thing in this painting, and he didn't think he was painting God. He didn't think he was painting relationships. Certainly, it's unambiguous that Van Gogh saw art as a spiritual practice. Remember, he started his career not as a painter, but as a minister, and ministered to the people in northern France and southern Belgium, the coal miners, among the poorest people in Europe. And he did everything he could to help them and to share Christian teachings with them. And they tolerated him for a while, and then finally went to the church and said, "You got to get rid of this guy. He's just too crazy. He means well, but he's nuts." So they actually kicked him out. He was a failed clergyman before he became a failed painter, before he became a genius. Monet really was the progenitor of French Impressionism, and by the end of his life had created artwork which was expressly about Guanxi. It was about the spiritual relationship between the artist and nature. Here, his backyard, basically, over 300 paintings of the water lilies, just the ponds in his backyard in Giverny. And he made these images not as pictures of beauty, which was what art was supposed to be about in the 19th century, but as the visceral experience of nature. And he did it on a large scale, a scale that nobody had ever done anything before, except maybe the Sistine Chapel. But his paintings of water lilies, you can go to Paris and see these images just expansive. You don't go into the Orangerie and look at a picture of the Namphis. You go in and have the experience of this. This becomes surrounding. He was really the first Western artist to understand that art is a destination. And the luminous effects of his work are evident. We have a sense of the sublime looking at his work: fear, terror, beauty, exaltation. Emmanuel called it the absolutely great. We use the term absolutely great. How was your trip to France? Oh, it was absolutely great. It's not what we mean. The sublime is something that is greater than we are, something with which we have a relationship. The first abstract artist, and really the first artist to talk about art as a spiritual practice, separate from religion, separate from dogma, separate from tradition, was Vasily Kandinsky. We talked about him last time too, but the idea of declaring that now there is artwork which refers only to itself becomes the primary model for spiritual practice for modern artists. The idea that blue and yellow and green and line and shape, all of the gestures here for Kandinsky had specific spiritual meaning that was associated for him with his own external spiritual practice of theosophy. His friend and protege, Kazimir Malevich, took the idea of non-objective art and pushed it to its extreme. But his idea was to create something that was revolutionary, not that something that connected him to nature, not something that connected him to anything, but something that stood oppositionally to the way of doing things. When he did these, everybody was shocked, outraged. How dare you make something as radical as this and call it art? Anybody could do that. That was the point. He was a radical modernist, a revolutionary. And we think of Guanxi as something that binds us to each other, but sometimes relationship is the act of opposing a status quo. It's a spiritual act that involves iconoclasm, that breaks the old way of doing things and establishes something entirely new. Hilma af Klint, again, we talked about her last time, was a pioneer of innovation and abstraction, art as a spiritual practice. But when Kandinsky and other new abstract painters in Europe came up to Sweden to visit her. They said, well, what's the theory of your work? And she said, oh, I just do what the voices tell me to do. And she built installations around those voices. Was she schizophrenic? Was she connected to the powers of the outer world? Her idea of relationship had to do with her relationship to hidden figures, the ascended beings that really told her what to do. She too was influenced by various forms of Eastern mysticism. My favorite painting, I think I showed last time as well, The Bride of the Wind by Oskar Kokoschka, really shows the idea of relationship between two people, but also their subsequent relationship to the forces of nature. I am connected to nature, and as I become aware of that, the nature itself becomes who I am. The boundaries between self, other, and the absolute disappear into meaninglessness. Georgia O'Keeffe depicted that kind of dissolving of boundaries. Images that everyone thought were very sexual became images that were transcendent. And again, Georgia O'Keeffe was not, quote, spiritual. She didn't talk about spirituality in the religious terms by which it was understood mostly in the early part of the 20th century. She understood spirituality as being absolutely intrinsic to her direct experience of nature. Jackson Pollock, famously, when he did these iconoclastic paintings in the early 50s, was asked if he was interested in the forces of nature, and he responded by saying, I am nature. One-ment by Barnett Newman, often overlooked as an abstract expressionist. He studied to be a rabbi and then went on to make images that were simple, austere images of non-duality. And that's the implication of Guanxi. The Guanxi that's practiced and thought of in Chinese philosophy, the relationship, basically takes us to one-ment, takes us to the idea, a pun on the Hebrew term of atonement, where we atone for our sins. Take the at off atonement and you get one-ment, becoming one thing. Think about that, non-duality. Ad Reinhardt, with his still painting, really spoke for a whole generation of reductivist abstract expressionist painters that reduced everything to one form in which patterns were subtly merged that had to be observed over time to be understood. There had to be a relationship between the viewer and the object to dissolve the boundaries between both. Adolf Gottlieb made these images rather graphically depicting his fear of nuclear holocaust. His Blast series, really the only structure, one that he discovered around 1957 and stayed with until he died in 1974, I think. The idea of the circle above and the dissolution of form below really was in his mind a kind of obsession with the nuclear holocaust that everyone in the 1950s and 60s thought was certain. In 1963, I think we came within 15 minutes of it. But the idea of oblivion is also part of Guanxi. Gordon Onslow Ford, we always mention Gordon when we talk at the Lucid Art Foundation. His idea of connection had to do with his view of the inner worlds. His view of the live light line beings that we've talked about before really was a form of an instrument of connection, not between the inner world or the outer world, but to the point in which the whole idea of world, inner and outer, dissolve into meaninglessness, and we have a single unmediated experience of the infinite. Mark Tobey, Gordon's sometime friend and competitor. I don't know, Fariba, I don't know how you would react to the relationship between Mark Tobey and Gordon Onslow Ford, but they both got to the same place. They were both making live light line beings in very, very different ways, but what varied was their own individual approach to Guanxi. Rothko, who was a miserable person, he always looked like he was about to be shot, had terrible anxiety, depression. As I mentioned before, killed himself the year I went to art school. But he left us the legacy of the Rothko Chapel, which is about Guanxi. It's about relationship. One sits in this room and it seems like a fairly dull room until you sit there for about 15 minutes, and then you begin to have the moment of connection, the idea of relationship. And you've discovered a sacred space. But the secret that Rothko reveals in his chapel was one that wasn't fully understood even in the great days of Gothic cathedrals. It was the idea that sacred space is both outer and inner 100% at the same time. Sacred space is a question of paradox. The only contemporary artist or architect that has been involved in the idea of sacred space specifically, I think, is Antoni Gaudi. And Gaudi conceived of the Sagrada Familia Chapel in Barcelona in the 1880s. He was an Art Nouveau artist, an architect, who had this amazing vision of spiritual transformation being the product of relationship to the interior of the Gaudi Chapel. Again, using archetypes, geometric structures, the cross, the circle, the square, and basically reconciling them so that all of them resolve the paradox of separation through relationship. The amazing thing about the Gaudi Cathedral or the Gaudi Chapel is that it was conceived over 100 years ago, and it's still under construction. Andy Goldsworthy goes out into nature and he finds structures. He finds things in nature, goes out for weeks at a time with his backpack and only the most rudimentary tools, a pair of shears for cutting things and a camera. And he arranges things that he finds and creates sacred space by really exploring his relationship to what's around him, and by inviting us to look differently at relationship. The idea of a relationship with a ball of ice is a completely frivolous notion. A ball of ice is going to stay a ball of ice unless it's in the South Pole for a very short time. Even in the South Pole, the ice is intrinsically unstable. So the idea of creating geometric structures using unreliable and unstable objects is a way of finding a relationship to the flow of the universe. The Lightning Field by Walter de Maria was a great example of this. When he laid out his grid of stainless steel poles in the New Mexico desert, everybody thought he was making a minimalist sculpture. It was sort of coming into vogue in the 70s. And he laughed when they said, oh, it's a nice sculpture. He said, no, wait for the storm to come. He invited his friends out for the first thunderstorm that hit that part of New Mexico, and they understood that what he was making was simply a way of connecting himself to the flow of nature. This was ultimately not about objects, it was about relationships, the relationships between the earth and the sky, the use of lightning and rain and hail as art supplies. Robert Irwin talks about his work being essentially noetic. He talks about the idea of being fascinated, even when he was an art student at Otis. He said he was fascinated with the question of what do we mean by meaning? The foundation of noetic science is really investigating the nature of meaning itself. And his response over the course of years, starting out as a minimalist painter and eventually doing installations using light to create the illusion of dissolving ourselves. Anybody who's ever walked into an Irwin sculpture or installation has this feeling that we're turning into something else. We're dissolving into light, just like the Isenheim altarpiece. James Turrell, I think probably one of the most spiritually aware artists today, makes large installations with a sense of humor. Bridget's Bardo here is an installation that was conceived as a pun on the name of the famous actress, Brigitte Bardot. A bardo is a Tibetan term that refers to the spiritual turbulence that happens at a significant point in your own spiritual development. At birth, at death, at various points, we go into kind of a psychic turmoil. And here, Turrell is using that term bardo to refer to a very calm meditative space that ultimately is about relationship. When one walks into a Turrell sculpture, if you're by yourself, it's a different sculpture than if there are 15 people in the sculpture. If the installation is crowded, it is a different experience than by yourself. So the ultimate point of this installation isn't to make beautiful colors or to make a pun on spirituality. It's really to force people's attention into understanding relationship. Turrell's greatest achievement is the rodent crater. Here's Turrell with his cowboy hat on. And he's really talking about celebrating the spectacle and the majesty, the sublime notion of nature, but he does it in such a way that people sit in a communal setting and then have a simultaneous experience of nature. Here, they sit in a room and look up in the lower right, and everyone suddenly looks up and sees the sky as a shared experience. So Turrell's work isn't just about the sublime notion of the landscape or earthworks. It's really about human relationships. Spiral jetty, same way, absolutely pointless. Who would spend $3 million on the construction of a huge jetty in the middle of the Salt Lake, which has no traffic, no boats? It just does nothing. It's a gigantic preposterousness, which is precisely the point. Celebrating the act of creativity for its own sake is a way of pointing to the relationship of people to nature and the absurdity of trying to finalize it or to make it a finite experience. Ana Mendieta, her famous iconic image of herself as the tree of life. It's not a spelling error, that's how she spells her last name. This is her image, basically the progenitor of ecofeminism, basically saying that her relationship to nature, her Guanxi with the forces of nature itself, is her whole point. She becomes the tree of life, and the tree of life simply connects heaven and earth. It's about relationship. Bill Viola, The Crossing is a massive image. If you ever get a chance to see it installed, it's really astonishing. It was in his retrospective at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, 25 years ago? And on one side of the screen, he's turning into fire. The other side of the screen, he's being inundated by a flood of water. And the soundtrack, this really loud sort of stereophonic soundtrack, starts out as the crackling of flames and the dripping of water and ends in the tumultuous roar of fire on one side and water on the other, and then slowly diminishes until the screen is empty and he has vanished. He has literally been consumed by the forces of nature. Guanxi. Burning Man is one of our great anthems, and the idea of burning an effigy of ourselves was the original idea of this annual event. Probably everybody in the room except me has been to the Burning Man, but the idea of building something that symbolizes ourself and then annihilating it becomes a relational act. Namjoon Paik's, again, iconic image from the Fluxus movement, an image of the Buddha looking at himself on a closed circuit TV, is all about relationship. What is our relationship with the Buddha? What is the Buddha's relationship with the Buddha? What's the relationship of looking at ourselves, looking at ourselves, looking at ourselves? Infinite intersubjectivity becomes a metaphor for Guanxi. So spirituality and the spark of genius, we think about Guanxi as being our connection to things, but we also think about art and spirituality as being something that comes from the spark of genius. We need a genius to touch us, like God here touching Adam and giving him the spark of life. Well, we need a personal God, we tell ourselves. So the question is, who's responsible for our own enlightenment? Who are the new great masters? Who do we follow? If we have Guanxi, who do we have Guanxi with? Where have all the gurus gone? We're living in an age of interrelationship, but we used to rely on the great gurus to tell us what path to follow. We followed Jesus. We followed Buddha. We follow Muhammad. This is all part of a tradition of great teachers. But I gave a lecture some time ago at the University of Southern California and was talking about the idea of, where did all the gurus go? And he said he was a medical student from India, and he said his parents in India were absolute followers of a particular guru, and all of their friends had gurus. And he now didn't need a guru because his parents, if they didn't know the answer to something, they would go to Guruji and the guru would tell them what to do. But now he said he could just open his cell phone and he has instantaneous access to everything in the world. He doesn't need a guru, he's got a cell phone. This guy, Thomas Carlyle, created the great man theory of history. He was a very interesting, kind of weird, icky kind of guy, but his theory was that history evolves only through the individual genius of great men. And the great men are the source of all civilization. So here, Leonardo da Vinci, nobody argues the fact that he's a great man. Do you follow Leonardo da Vinci? Do you want to be like Leonardo when you grow up? I don't know, but his work certainly changed history. Erasmus took the Reformation and turned it into philosophical structure that really changed the face of at least Northern Europe. My favorite portrait of a great man, this is Descartes, René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. He was a drinking buddy of Frans Hals, great Dutch Baroque portraitist. And here, this great man is shown not as being this eminence grise, this enlightened being, but he's somebody you wouldn't mind going out and having a beer with. The relationship is still there. This is William Blake's famous heroic image of Isaac Newton as a kind of mythic figure, a hero of reason and rationality, a great man. My great man, my favorite artist, William Turner, probably the most flattering portrait ever done of him. And Vincent van Gogh. Do we follow Van Gogh? Do we say, well, gee, what would Van Gogh have done? Less and less. Do we define ourselves by the great artists of history? There's Rothko looking anxious, Toulouse-Lautrec looking prosperous, different artists in different guises, but they're all variations on Carlyle's idea of the great man. Sigmund Freud was a great man, even though nobody really follows his teachings exactly anymore. He's been deified and then sort of deposed a little as being imperfect. Freudian psychoanalysis is still a cornerstone of contemporary psychotherapy, but its individual tenets have been challenged tremendously. Marilyn Monroe changed the course of things. She was the first ever sex goddess. There were sexy women, great actresses, great film stars. The idea of celebrity as an objective of spiritual practice, it seems like a weird juxtaposition, but it's the ultimate Guanxi. It's the ultimate connection. Who was Marilyn Monroe? Well, who she was as a person doesn't matter. It's her iconography that matters. Mao Zedong, same way. Didn't have much to say about Guanxi. He thought it was all about revolution, but understood on some level that it was about being a celebrity. He wanted to be the leader. But the ultimate leader, the one who probably is the most recent, quote, great man, is Stephen Jobs. And he gave us the cell phone. He gave us this little object that we can hold up and have an infinite connection with. And I think the purpose of my lecture is to suggest that it's the invention of the internet, the immediate accessibility to everything. This is a computer model of what the internet would look like if we connected all of the parts. Looks remarkably like a galaxy, like a neuron. It's the microcosm, macrocosm image of the divine that we are connected to probably 10 or 15 times a day when we get on our cell phone and we do our internet or we do a Zoom. We're instantaneously connected to every place in the world in a second through the technology developed partially by Steve Jobs and Mike Wozniak, of micro atomic technology. Microprocessors now function not just using atoms, and electrons, but positrons and negatrons. Subatomic physics, which was just science fiction stuff about 50 years ago, is now something we use every day. There has been a fundamental change in human consciousness. This is another digital diagram of how the internet works. And it becomes an infinite pattern. We've seen it before. The idea of the internet as an infinite structure is now the foundation for digital art. This was the most recent shocking scandal in people paying way too much money for art. The first 5,000 days is a website, a digital image made by the digital artist Beeple and sold at auction for $38 million. He was astonished. Everyone was astonished because for $38 million, you don't even get an object. You just get a bunch of electrons. The idea is the same. The idea of infinite interconnection here shows up in a Sufi mandala. The Star of David at the center isn't a reference to Judaism. It's a reference to the interpenetration of male and female energy, the balance of opposites in the universe. But it replicates what we get to on the internet. The Kaaba in Mecca, in Arabia, is the center of a universe in exactly the same way that the internet has us at the center of it. There's no center. But in Islam, everybody bows down to the Kaaba 5 times a day and literally creates a circle. The circle is the size of the earth. 5 times a day, all the faithful point towards Mecca and bow down and create a circle that extends from Mecca and Saudi Arabia to wherever you are. It's a fundamental shift in consciousness. Here's my friend Alex Gray's image of a kind of electronic version of yoga. The idea of all of the chakras open electronically. And it's really intended as a way of humanizing, creating a connection between our individual selves, our cosmic selves, and a kind of science fiction come true version of the internet. The kinds of art that have come about as a result of the internet are surprising. It's not just about digital art. The whole idea of digital art is a non sequitur. Instead, art has been made now in the 21st century based on the ideas, the images, and the relationships that come from an infinite connection. Chen Fei's image of miracle is a miraculous image that doesn't talk about being Chinese. It didn't talk about anything other than I'm celebrating myself. Fan Lijun makes identity art, struggling for his own identity in a world where everything is connected. And he doesn't know whether to laugh or scream or cry. He is like billions of us in a constant state of anxiety and euphoria. This is the same guy who did the adding 1 meter to an anonymous Chinese mountain at the beginning of the talk. Zhang Huan did this image as part of a fresh ink show that was initially shown in China, but came to the Museum of the Metropolitan Museum about 5 years ago. And he starts by writing on his face until his entire face is black. Carrie Mae Weems makes identity art about being an African-American woman. And it's in the middle of a time when everything is dissolving into everything, and identity art becomes now the most powerful form, one of the most powerful forms of contemporary art that approaches the spiritual reality of our lives by affirming our own identity. And by affirming our own identity, we examine and share our past, our history. The idea of using text no longer as a vehicle for communicating ideas solely, but using the text itself as an object becomes part of identity art. This is a piece done by one of our students in China, Lily Lane, who went through, as many of them do, and I'll talk about this when I do my talk in May, the idea of language as one of the ways to affirm identity. So she writes in English, but sometimes she writes in Chinese, and sometimes she just writes in symbols. But the idea is to create intimate experiences of relationship using text and object. Another one of our students from ANC, Kate White, makes identity art that's really funny. She does images often of herself. Here she's wearing a paper bag and trying to paint. But her work is simultaneously humorous and about affirmation of identity, but always about relationship, always about, look at me, think about how I relate to you. How do I relate to this? One of my favorites is Death saying to her, hey, you okay? Another of my Chinese MFA students, Jeremy, you'll remember this one. Making an image of himself, making an image of being a young Indian man living and studying in India. But here, doing this really outrageous image, affirming his own identity. The sexual metaphor of the rocket going off becomes humorous, becomes ultimately about relationship. So relational art itself is based on Guanxi. Joseph Beuys used the Free University as a way of promoting Guanxi. The idea of having a university that has no teachers, no classes, no tuition, it's an open forum for anybody who wants to get together, was social practice art that came directly out of a sense undiscovered for the most part, of Guanxi. The area of interconnection that I referred to before is exemplified every morning. As you walk through China, you see people doing Tai Chi, finding connection, finding relationship. Here's another of Zhang Huan's pieces, not adding 3 feet to or adding 1 meter to a mountain, but adding 1 centimeter to an anonymous Chinese pond. All the people who were standing in the pond displaced that amount of water. Santiago Sierra does relational art here, having paid laborers in, I think in the Dominican Republic, to allow him to tattoo a line across all of their backs. Here they're lined up against the wall, and their line creates an artificial form of Guanxi. Daniel Etok uses relational art as a way of exemplifying our natural relationship and totally understands the concept of Guanxi. The Artist Is In by Marina Abramovich is 5 people waited for hours to sit in a chair opposite Marina, just to sit and look at her for as long as they wanted. She agreed to spend 8 hours a day sitting in this chair in the Museum of Modern Art and would take anybody on. Here in the lower right, she's unexpectedly reunited with her former performance partner, Ule, and former lover. But the idea is not about the object. It's not about the fact that she's wearing a red dress. It's about relationship. Ultimately, Guanxi is what makes the world go round. Ping Pong Go Round by Li Wen, a Taiwanese artist, is really having a good time, but it's all about Guanxi. Material art, the latest, I think, the latest and most profound form of art, has been around for a while, but it hasn't been identified except as tangible objects, things we can reach out and touch. The Mother Mary by Chris O'Feely from England, a Nigerian English artist using elephant dung as the raw material of his work. El Anatsui uses pieces of cardboard torn off, makes heroic architectural objects, gigantic freestanding walls made of cast off objects as a metaphor for his own identity as an African. Africa, he says, is a nation forced to piece together its own identity out of other people's garbage. Wolfgang Leib from China, from Germany, is a material artist who makes enormous installations with powder, saffron, flour, pollen, images that become sacred objects, just sifted flour, or in this case, sifted pollen, on the floor of the Museum of Modern Art. And here, from the show a couple of years ago in LA, The Allure of Matter, material art from China. This is material art, but it's ultimately about relationship. Material by itself has no value, it has no meaning. It's only when the material is placed in relationship to the viewer, as Michael Heiser's famous elevated mass does here. To walk underneath this rock, you have to deal with the rockness. You have to deal with the relationship between you and that object. The Silk Pavilion by Stephen Keating is about dissolving oneself into materiality. And frivolity and spectacle finally comes up in the end. The famous, notorious piece by Damien Hirst called For the Love of God is a skull of a child which has $2.3 million worth of diamonds attached to it. It went for auction at $14 million. Therefore, the price of the skull is about $2 million. Well, the price of the skull is about $12 million, minus the cost of the diamonds. So the idea of frivolity becomes the new sublime, the new kind of relationality is expressed here at Burning Man as spectacle, as connection, as Guanxi. Dissolving the boundaries between ourselves and others is the new form of art. It exists on a worldwide scale all the time. The work that I'm seeing coming out of the MFA program these days takes frivolity. Here, Lady Gaga, as the emblem of frivolity. People think she's a rock star. She's actually intentionally a performance artist. She sees her persona as Lady Gaga as a work of art, not as a work of pop culture. She collaborated with Jeff Koons on this poster. Art poop says it all. So the idea of the sublime dissolving into frivolity is possible, especially insisted upon by the technology and the cultural dissolutions that happen because of internet culture. We live in a world where absurdity is celebrated as a way of affirming relationship. We also live in a time where everything goes and everything is constantly in chaos. There's chaos, but there's also order. Chaos is hell, says Jenny Holzer. And finally, the aphorism that I like most from Sanskrit, tat tvam asi. I've mentioned it to a few of you. Some of you know the term. It simply means thou art that. You are the thing you're looking at. That's Guanxi. Okay. And that is a slightly over time presentation. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Mike. It was very thought-provoking, and I made so many notes, and just was very full and rich. Thank you for this wonderful overview, and also at the same time very in-depth view. That really, I really enjoyed it, and I just made a few notes, and it was so provoking for me, thought-provoking. One of the things that I'm very interested in, the relationship between curators and artists. When I Googled this term, and I came across this research that was done in Today Art Museum with the Chinese curator who got engaged with some of the artists that he wanted to show. And the dialogue, the relationship between the artist and the curator. And that was very interesting for me, that how they're practicing this Guanxi in even bringing the connection between artist and the curator. So the curator no longer is the one who chooses what artist is doing, but is interested to see what the artist is saying and creating. So that really was very thought-provoking for me when I was just doing the research. You asked one thing, I jot down things that you have asked. Like, you showed Gordon's work and Toby's work, and you asked me about that. I think that Gordon was very much influenced by Toby, instead of the other way around. Toby with his white line, Gordon with his live line, and Gordon with his live line being. And that comes directly from Toby, that concept of Gordon's live line being, which is a character that in his surrealist paintings was called the personages, but as it moved faster and faster into these cosmology paintings, it became live line being. But that comes directly from Toby. And then I thought about another thing that it was very provoking, and I never really thought about it. I mean, I thought about it, but then not in this terms. It's about the term lucid art. Is the relationship between the mystery, the art, and the viewer. So that relationship, the intersubjectivity of these spaces, that is very, very important. Right. And another thing that I wanted to say is about one thing you showed about Bill Viola. If you remember, you took all of us from our department to go and meet him. I believe it was in 1996 or 1997 at the San Francisco Museum. And he didn't mention about his influence with Buddhism, if you remember. He just basically, people said, well, we can see that philosophy there, but he says, shh, don't say anything. Yes, it is. But because at the time, you could not use the S word in the art world, the spiritual. But then years later, the same thing he showed at Whitney, and it was written about, what was his real influence with the spiritual in art. And now, sorry?
Somebody from ANC went up to Bill at that lecture. We had a whole day devoted to just students. And he was talking about the other group that they were meeting with him, was asking him all kinds of really silly technical questions and what kind of camera did he use? And he was getting really frustrated. And somebody from our group made a statement about spirituality, and he acted very defensive. And he says, well, we don't talk about that, as you say.
Right.
And when somebody went up and realized that he was misunderstanding the question, I can't remember who did it. Maybe it was one of you, I don't remember. But somebody just went up and gave him a hug and said, honey, that's what we do. And he was completely disarmed and said, they let you do that? Wow, can I come and hang out?
That's right.
He was completely embracing the idea that all art is taught through the spiritual. And there are very few people who come out and say that. The S word is still a little dangerous to use, but people are using other terms now. Liminality comes up a lot as a metaphor, as a way of describing spirituality without getting all religious. Transformational, as in transformative arts. All of these new words are being used to signify what we used to call spirituality. And I think Guanxi is probably going to be one of them eventually, if people figure out how to pronounce it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's almost like sometimes certain words that we use, it's laden with presuppositions and has certain kind of definitions. So you come up with a word that doesn't have that connection with all sorts of presupposition, like the spirituality, people connected with religions, spirituality. Right. But I just wanted to let you know, and everybody in this group, is that actually in the art world, because I've connected a lot to art historians in here and museum people, they are very interested. Now they are very interested. That's one of the reasons some of the women artists' work, like Hilma Klint, right. She was one of the most viewed exhibition in Guggenheim, at Guggenheim, and then now Venice Biennale. They have women surrealists. And so I think that it's really coming out, like the whole, their work with Tarot, all the esoteric work with Uspensky. And so I think that the arts and consciousness, time has arrived. We don't have to hide anymore because they are starting to get really interested. So that's, and I meet with these people who were very skeptical about these terms. And, I've been here for a long time, so they would come and visit me and I know how the conversation was. And now the conversation is very different. They actually ask me, so what did this person read? And they go and read it. They go and study it. And so I'm really excited about that. So I wanted to tell you that the work that we're all doing, time has arrived, and everybody should just put your work out. It is its time, finally. So it was really, really thought-provoking, and thank you for this talk. And I just want to open it up to any comments, any questions anybody has. at this point for Mike. And then you can unmute yourself if you're asking a question.
When I gave a similar speech or talk at USC, I was talking about gurus, and several people in the audience got really pissed off. They got annoyed and said, well, you know, I've got a guru and I love my guru and gurus are where it's at. And I'm fine with that. It's just that they were offended by challenging the old view of spirituality as kind of religious and sanctimonious and dogmatic. So the new idea, the reason maybe that, as you're saying, religion is sort of dissipating and spirituality is coming forward, is that people are getting rid of the associations of sanctimoniousness and preachiness of the old religious approach, even to art. So the idea that you have to.
Well, you know, the way I see it, Mike, is that some people are just really into their religion, and that's what they do, and then people who are into their spirituality is really hard to say. But with as far as the art, what you have shown, the development of art and how it's coming from where we were with the connection with nature, and then well, first was the more personalized God, and then slowly shifting.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. My ancestry is Persian, and in the Farsi language, we don't have gender. So we don't have he or she. So when I grew up, God did not have a gender. Yeah. So in certain languages, we just don't have certain kind of a concept. So I really never had this image of God as a man with a beard. And that was introduced to me when I came to England, to the West. I was like, oh, that's just how their God is. So this personalized God, but that was so strong for so long, and it still is. But it's very interesting to see how it's shifting in the art world and how the art world is assimilating it. Just like how you were saying, the Burning Man is becoming the, I mean, it was recently in Sotheby's, they did the whole section on Burning Man. And people who went to Burning Man, artists who created from Burning Man. So it's evolving, and we just are witness of it.
The French writer Nicolas Bourriaud really got it right. He wrote Relational Art or Relational Aesthetics in 2002. And his argument was that, excuse me, that relationality isn't just the new thing in art, but it's what's designated art throughout all the years as being important. It's the art that changes things. And his argument is that it isn't the artist who changes things, it's the art. The art changes relationships. It's not the great man theory of art, it's the great art theory of people. So the great art is what changes the conversation, because art itself is relational. Mona Lisa changed the way people thought about portraiture. The Demoiselles d'Avignon changed the way people thought about structure and humanity. Pollock changed things, but it wasn't he who changed it, it was the work. So the idea of separating individual power from the transformational qualities of art is what's happening now. It's happening right now, and it's happening because, I think, of the internet and also the ascension of women as strategic players in history. It's no longer the great man theory of art, it's men and women together theory of art. Or the